as we continue this three-day focus on aligning Caribbean archives and records for digital and sustainable futures. A short recap, yesterday was a fascinating first day. We explored the politics of digital transformation, digitization, digital preservation, digital archives and records, archival standards and processes, and social media outreach. And this afternoon, we wish to explore document and preserving, community archiving, and how archivists engage communities. To start us off this afternoon, we will be exploring the topic, documenting and preserving the Caribbean. And our keynote speaker is Lorraine Nero. Lorraine is a senior librarian 1 and special collections librarian at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus. She has direct oversight of rare books, manuscripts, and archives held in the Alma Jordan Library. She holds a postgraduate qualification in cultural studies, library science, and teaching and learning with emerging technologies. She's an active member of several local and regional organizations, some of which include the Library Association of Trinidad and Tobago, ACURIL, and UNESCO's Memory of the World Committee for Trinidad and Tobago, which is responsible for identifying, recording the documentary history of that island. She has published and conducted workshops and presented on the topic of unique Caribbean resources and their significance for research. Let us all welcome Lorraine, and we look forward to this intriguing presentation. Welcome, Lorraine.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Just give me a minute. Let me just share my screen, please. Thanks. Good afternoon to CARBICA's President, Avril Reed, members of the CARBICA's executive, fellow participants. It is always good to be in the presence of information professionals, and I extend my thanks to the team for the invitation to do this presentation today and join the conversation as we try to get our house in order. When I was asked to explore the topic of documenting and preserving the Caribbean, I could not move past my initial reflective question of whose Caribbean is being documented and preserved. In fact, it plunged me into a tailspin as I not only looked at what we practice, but also what the writers of Caribbean archival thought have been intimating about this issue. Therefore, I want to take you on that whirling dive, highlighting some current perspectives from Caribbean archivists on the topic and some implications for our practices as we get our house in order. Since this is a virtual conference presentation, I'm hoping that you will light up the chat with your comments, questions, and sharing information as I progress. We all generally acknowledge that Caribbean libraries and archives have steadfastly collected and preserved notions of our histories and identities about this space many of us call home. And we do accept that not everything could be retained and archived. The act of archiving the Caribbean is like the jigsaw puzzle you see before you, trying to reconstruct the whole while pieces disappear with time. But the question that each professional engaged in the practice of collecting and preserving would have to confront one day is whose idea of the Caribbean are we collecting and preserving? That reflective question can propel you to either change your focus, evolve as a practitioner, identify gaps in the collections, hopefully temper your personal biases, or in some cases like me, haunt you as you become fully aware that there would always be records, topics, issues that are on the fringes that you would miss and that may never make it into our records. Because ultimately, the records kept and archived create a version of the Caribbean. The wrestling with this idea of whose Caribbean is being preserved or whose Caribbean gets focused, and understanding how these definitions and perceptions impact Caribbean identities are issues Professor Norman Girvan would return to time and time again in his writings. Girvan suggested in various ways that the definition of the Caribbean changes and shifts according to the language, residual influences of colonial power, which shore the Caribbean Sea washes, aid agency criteria, and with whom governments align themselves. This shifting definition is not just the domain of Caribbean theorists, but the lived experiences of archivists and librarians who make decisions daily about what to acquire, what to retain, what to archive, and how to provide access. In some cases, we have institutionalized in some of our collection development policies interpretations of the Caribbean and our individual nation states. These guide our daily activities and will not only shape our present understanding of the Caribbean, but those of future generations of researchers. That is the quiet power that archives possess, and hence the reason we must contend with regularly the issue of whose Caribbean we are collecting and preserving. For example, my parent organization is called West Indiana and Special Collections. According to TISA 2020, nowadays, West Indies means English-speaking islands. Therefore, our name already prioritizes the English-speaking Caribbean. And while the Caribbean Sea may wash the shores of Cuba and Puerto Rico, those are currently not priority areas to build unique and archival collections around. Yet, we recognize the bias. And we also recognize the importance of these territories. So our approach is to ensure that the general reading collections provide enough resources to help researchers. And we can guide them to alternative repositories for information. Another area, another bias that we acknowledge is that because we are located in Trinidad and Tobago, it is easier to network and get collections within this space. Therefore, we make overtures and continue to seek ways to offset imbalances in the collections we detect, offset imbalances in our collections. It is important to continuously identify collection strengths and weaknesses, to acknowledge and document the rationale for your choices that would result in historical gaps in the future. And yes, you can be criticized for these choices, but those criticisms are the start of conversations that can help you redefine and evolve in the future. My question to you, and I hope to see responses in the chat later, what are the boundaries of your archives? And what boundaries are you currently rethinking? The boundaries and scope of Caribbean archives are also shaped by other factors. Here, I return to Girvan, and Girvan stated, the notion of Caribbean has been and is being continuously redefined and reinterpreted in response to external influences and to internal currents. What if we inserted archives next to Caribbean in that excerpt? Let me read it with the insertion. The notion of Caribbean archives has been and is being continuously redefined and reinterpreted in response to external influences and internal currents. While Gervin was exploring this topic largely from theoretical and geopolitical frames, once the archival lens are imposed on the text, it causes you to consider the external influences and internal currents within your domain that influence which aspects of the Caribbean gets preserved at any point in time. We touched on the collection development policy using West Indiana as the example. And we know the focus of our parent organization is also influential. But let's look at some others. What about your personal biases? Have you acknowledged that this can be a factor that makes you decide which resources you eagerly pursue or eliminate, and ultimately shape which aspect of the Caribbean is being preserved? Just think about Caribbean music. Reggae. If you're going to preserve that, you can put up your hand. Sorry, we're not present, so we can clap and share, etc. If you're going to preserve Calypso, yes, clap, share, soca, zouk. Right, we have those. Then we start to get to the issue of dance hall. How you feel about Movado? Rapso. How you feel about the new Trinidad music? Will these make it into our collections and into our archives? Not yet, right? So personal biases is something we have to continue to interrogate. Then we have the effect of budgets, and in some cases, I call it non-budgets. Non-budgets is when you have allocations on paper, but the money never gets over to you to spend, or it gets vied to another pressing issue. So budgets can impede our ability to purchase resources, build collection, preserve them. It also makes it difficult for us to compete with well-funded Caribbean collections outside the shores of the Caribbean Sea. Let me say that again. Non-budgets make it difficult to compete with well-funded Caribbean collections outside the shores of the Caribbean Sea. And while many outside the profession clamor for us to digitize and make the rich resources available, the budgets are sometimes not there to provide long-term sustainability of many digital projects birthed with enthusiasm. Our physical space also defines the Caribbean Archive, as it determines, can you accommodate any more of that type of material? Do you have the scope, the space to work on these resources? That can also shape it. The human resources to process, to preserve, and make the materials accessible. Then we have risks such as hurricane and fires, and we are still trying to cope with the fire that destroyed the Folk Research Center of St. Lucia. And then there is the creeping threat of security in archives. Something sometimes we take for granted. It's the languages, and I'm not just speaking about our Spanish, English, French that is in the region, but in the various creoles that we have. Can we accommodate them, represent them, describe them, and make these accessible? Then we have to consider lobby groups as well, who demand more from us, and no, this is not an annoyance. I think the latter, when they demand more from us, is to open a conversation for improvement. So these are just some of the external and internal factors that shape them. Our stories are replete with organizations and persons who have tried to surmount many of these barriers. I will come to some of those stories soon. For those who have gone through the reflective process of considering who's Caribbean, there is also a fervor to recover, to facilitate reinterpretation and reconstitute archives. That conversation among archivists from the Caribbean perspective was most tangibly represented in the 2018 publication by Bastian, Aarons, and Griffiths. In this seminal work, the trio explored the ideas surrounding who's Caribbean by looking at the notion of decolonizing the archive. The power of the work echoed in several ways. Through strong phrases in the introduction. Some of these were, the power of archives can be subverted to serve the oppressed, disrupt traditional notions of archives, decolonizing the archives. Yes, words that sound like a revolution is about to start, and it is indeed so. The work argued that it is important for Caribbean practitioners to gain control, tell their stories, and disrupt traditional notions of archives. Hence, the volume of 40 essays presents strongly the voice of practitioners and their initiatives that are moving towards that recovery process. And some of those highlighted are Thomas and O'Flaherty from St. Kitts, who dealt with addressing gaps in our collections through innovative collection development and outreach. There were works expanding the boundaries of the archival practice we inherited, such as mass, music, looking at monuments, and surmounting those barriers highlighted before, such as Spain in Guyana and Penmal in the BVI. In essence, the words and stories were the testimony of a Caribbean archival rebellion, of persons willing to face the issue of whose Caribbean are we archiving. Solid as this piece of work turned out to be, it is evident that archives and the traditions that prioritizes the printed text are still dominant and drive the mindset behind how we collect, arrange, and make materials accessible. We cannot truly escape the foundation upon which this profession was founded. We operate within a printed text framework. This is why perspectives and work from our sister brother organizations that prioritize memory are also important in assisting to preserve the Caribbean. Those explorations and efforts have largely been encapsulated in terms of heritage and memory. Here, I turn to another significant publication. It is noteworthy that Reed 2012 edited a collection of essays about Caribbean heritage and considered tangible and intangible forms of heritage and memory through topics such as Anansian storytelling, medicinal practices, architecture, and industrial heritage, and the environment. The collection can be viewed as the start of a checklist of topics that can be examined for further documentation and preserving. But like many who wrestle with the idea of documenting and preserving the collection, Reed will consider that idea of the Caribbean definition and the impact it has. In the introduction to Caribbean heritage, Reed discussed identity formation in the independent Caribbean nations and indicated that one of the crucial issues is the question of whose heritage within the nation state became important, thereby narrowing the focus to a national level. Consequently, the question for those working at the national level would be whose Martinique, whose Anguilla, whose Barbados, or whose Haiti is your archive prioritizing, and whose memories are silent. Wong Sang, 2018, confronted the issue of whose Trinidad and Tobago is being documented and preserved through a national survey of 19 organizations, of which she detected that there were still prevalent sentiments and perceptions of cultural marginalization among 11 of them. 11 of the 19 had prevalent sentiments and perceptions of cultural marginalization. Those 11 disagreed that all cultural groups were equally represented in the national canon. That for a local survey is rather significant. What if this research was replicated in the various territories of the Caribbean? Would it be similarly telling? And here is scope for more archival research to be done, right? So how do we in the library and archival field continue to confront and address the question of whose Caribbean are we documenting and preserving? I suggest expanding on our collaborative initiatives with public and some private agencies. And today, I want to emphasize the memory institutions, and here I highlight the work of the National Cultural Foundation of Barbados, the Patrick Anthony Folk Research Center of St. Lucia, Dominica's Folk Research Center, the African Caribbean Institute, or as we call it, the Jamaica Memory Bank. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have initiatives by the Lloyd Best Institute and its Caribbean Yard Project, and the National Council of Indian Culture. What you can do in the chat for me is feel free to share memory organizations in your respective territories and any programs of collaboration that are taking place that allow the archives to explore other ways of documenting history and memory. That collaboration I'm speaking about is not necessarily for us in the archival field to impose our print-inspired frames on their approaches, but to share our strengths to help us to develop a sensitivity to other ways of knowing and representing. It affords us the opportunity to listen. It is why the work of Bastian and Alexander, 2009, and Wong Sang, 2018, advocates for community archives are important for us to consider and move towards implementation. The sessions this afternoon following this presentation would be exploring archivists in the community, and I presume we will get to discuss further collaboration with memory and heritage organizations. The invitation to listen as a way of confronting the idea of whose Caribbean is being archived was the overriding sentiment that remained with me after reviewing the second significant volume of Aaron's, Bastian, and Griffith's 2022. It is instructive that the piece by Malcolm inside there, where he takes a look at the digital Caribbean by discussing Twitter as an archive, is aptly subtitled Listening to the Articulate Minority. While in the first volume, the power and the voice of Caribbean archivists were strong, this second volume is also a call for professionals to pause, listen, and possibly see new records and other ways of Caribbeanizing the archives. The authors indicated that the intention of the work is to move Caribbean archives away from these colonial beginnings and towards a definition that reflects the dynamic cultural life and lived experience of the region. Coming 10 years after Reed's work, the trio not only confront the issue of who's Caribbean and its relevance to the archival field, but also begin to explore how to escape the textual frames that dominate the profession in the region. I would like to add that this is part of a global archival movement. Consequently, the work captured a range of tangible and intangibles as repositories of memory, such as music, memorials, landscape, persons, and tweets. Identifying these cultural facets for preservation is one part of the process. Now we have to consider how to disrupt the methodologies we have learned and to produce new or adopt alternative schemas to describe the structures that represent non-textual memories. For example, my question to that special group of archivists who work with metadata, encoded archival descriptions, crosswalks for various platforms, how is ISA-G working for you? ISA-G, the international standard for archival descriptions. Are you able to apply this to all types of Caribbean archival resources? Is the linear structure deeply embedded in the standard working well for you with digital resources? In recognition of the need to expand description beyond textual frames that can also silence some records, the records in context standard emerged from the ICA, that is the International Council of Archives. And the expectation is that archives transition to the new standard. The latest consultative version dated December 2021. And it states in the introduction, although it focuses on physical records, it embraces and supports archival description that is hospitable to an inclusive understanding of records and archives. The RIC standard, which is the Records in Context standard, recognizes that the inability to describe and make accessible some records means that some communities can be easily left behind and their memories erased over time. The task within the Caribbean archival community is to determine the extent to which our records can be appropriately represented within this new structure and make recommendations for alternative ways when we detect that our experiences can help make significant changes. Recently, in March, we had the Spiritual Baptist holiday. And as usual, around whatever season we have, I tend to try to learn a little thing new about the community. So this time around, I started to explore doptions, D-O-P-T-I-O-N-S. Doptions are the guttural chants synonymous with spiritual Baptists when they enter into deep spiritual and community worship. I found out that our local catalogs did not have doption inside of it. So doption is an area, if we have to address gaps, we will have to explore. But can the standards from both libraries and archives document and describe the complexities of the dips and rises in tonal and guttural sounds of doptions? That is something we have to look at to see how these standards are capturing our Caribbean, because if we are unable to capture them, then these can be left behind. To move forward, if we are to address gaps like these, it requires a community partnership, for example, with the Spiritual Baptists, so they can tell us how to collect, how to describe, and represent the sacred practice with sensitivity and respect. In essence, asking us to assume the posture of the listener. While I may have used this group, there are other instances of these gaps within the Caribbean not documented and preserved. That is why I see Bastian et al.'s work as the beginning of the exploration. Bastian et al. Publication have brought us to a point of the River Jordan as the Calypsonian Black Stallion rhetorically questioned. How we go reach the River Jordan and then turn back? No, woman, we can't turn back now. As we consider whose Caribbean we are documenting and preserving and the standards we use to describe them, there is another Caribbean that the archival community has to confront. The deep dive into the born digital awaits us. Our digital projects are still heavily focused on shifting analogs to digital across various platforms. What about the born digital? What structures have you begun to put in place in your organizations to manage and archive these records? Each day, terabytes of Caribbean data are generated. How do we begin to sift through what to keep and how to keep them? How do we convince governments about the importance of big data preservation and archiving? And more importantly, to access sustainable funding to support these initiatives. Sustainable funding to support these initiatives. It calls for a strong lobby by archivists and librarians to confront and finance born digital archiving in the region and to get in on the conversations about data archiving. What about the Gen Z Caribbean? Those that dwell in the social media spaces, delivering content, witticism, and commentary online. Is their Caribbean worthy of preservation? Malcolm 2022, in discussing Jamaica's Twitter archive, speak to the value of this social media resource that should be preserved. So yes, a few of us are testing the waters, but we have to train and encourage the new archivists to navigate both print and the digital Caribbean. Those of us who are settled in the profession must continue to retrain ourselves to also focus on this aspect of the Caribbean identity. I am happy that CARBICA continues with their training programs in the digital domain, evident in some of the workshops offered this year. Yes, we are all at that river. There is no nautical map showing us how to contend with this domain. But Black Stallion, that bard of positivity, said in another of his calypsos, we can make it if we try. We can do this as an archival body in the region. Take small steps together. I hope to see small working groups driven by the new generation of archivists in the region, exploring projects that seek to preserve the Gen Z Caribbean and create best practices. Sometimes we just have to do this small project by small project, sharing our successes and failures. And I repeat, don't hide the failures. Share the failures so we can all learn. Because if we don't confront the virtual Caribbean, we're speaking about house, we're speaking about getting our house in order. If we don't confront the virtual Caribbean, it is a house that will be washed away with time as we stand on the shores looking. Colleagues, I have taken you on this whirling dive into the issue of whose Caribbean, looking at how these have been framed, implications for practices, and considerations for the future. And I hope you now understand just why I could not move past that initial reflective question of whose Caribbean are we documenting and preserving? I thank you.